Back to that fiscal update delivered by the finance minister yesterday. What was in it? Plenty of new spending, new tax measures, much of it in response to changes south of the border. Global's David Aiken now with some of the takeaways.
When Donald Trump cut corporate tax rates on January the 1st, Canadian business pressed the Trudeau government to match that cut to try to prevent Canadian jobs and investment from going south. The government responded.
Finance Minister Bill Morneau announced a suite of new tax changes that will allow businesses to write off the cost of investments in new equipment. Those changes go into effect immediately and will lower the effective tax rate businesses pay from 17% to 13.8%. The government says that is significantly lower than the U.S. and will be the lowest overall rate in the G7. But there's a cost. Lower tax revenue, along with a handful of new spending measures, means there will be no balanced budget by next year, as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised on the campaign trail in 2015. In fact, it's deficits as far as the eye can see from the Trudeau Liberals. It will be just over $18 billion this year and just under $20 billion in the red next year.
We could have ignored the concerns of business leaders, decided not to make the investments and the changes that are part of the fall economic statement, and we would have had a lower deficit as a result. To do so would be neither a rational response nor a responsible one.
The Liberals, though, are betting voters will not care about that broken promise on deficits because the economy is booming. The unemployment rate is the lowest in 40 years. Wage growth is on track to be the best in a decade, and business profits are up too, also near decade highs.
When the members opposite push for an aggressive elimination of the deficit, what they really mean are aggressive cuts in services, cuts that will make life harder for people and for families.
This was not really a consumer-friendly fiscal update. There was no change to the personal income tax rate, no change to GST, no change to any personal tax credits, and no change in the Trudeau government's plan to introduce a carbon tax on January the 1st. David Aiken, Global News, Ottawa.
So let's now bring in Danielle Smith from Global News Radio 770 CHQR to continue the conversation on this one. It's a big day here, Danielle. We just heard from the Premier there. And when it comes to that fiscal update, no mention of help for our oil industry. That carbon tax still firmly in place.
You know, it's funny because a lot of our listeners say, why, oh, why is it that in Eastern Canada they don't talk about our differential? And the reason they don't talk about it is because our federal leaders don't talk about it. There was an eensy-teensy mention to Alberta and the fact that we're not getting our international prices on our oil. And then right after that, it was followed by about 6 paragraphs on the climate leadership plan and pricing pollution and how we have to stop pollution and how we have to move to green technology. I think the only conclusion Albertans can come from with this is that the federal government hasn't made the connection, that the reason why they were announcing $18 billion deficits into the foreseeable future with no end in sight is because Alberta is suffering. Alberta has been the principal contributor to federal success over the last 10 or 20 years. And now you've got a federal government that either is being willfully blind because they can't stomach the idea of actually genuinely supporting our oil patch in a meaningful way, or they're just their attitude is, meh, I guess we'll just move on and try to develop an economic generator in Ontario and Quebec where we can get more votes anyway. If Calgarians want this to be a national issue, Rachel Notley's doing her part, Joe Ceci is doing his part. But every time we have the Prime Minister in town and there's a rally organized by either the Canada Oil Sands Action Group or by the Rally for Resources, you get a few dozen people show up and nobody ends up doing any coverage of it outside of our own province. If they had 2,000 people show up today at the Hyatt, if they had 5,000 people show up at the Hyatt, guaranteed it would send the message not only to the federal government, but to everybody else in the rest of the country that we're hurting, we're collectively hurting, and the only way for us to actually solve this problem that we have at the federal level is to get Alberta back in business again. But that message, wow, totally missed out in the fiscal budget yesterday.
I know we'll be talking about it all day. You as well, Danielle, and your show starting at 9:30 on Global News Radio. Thanks for your time.
Yep, my pleasure.